Having experienced a record turnaround in refueling, restocking and rearming, USS Enterprise was back out at sea again on the 9th of December 1941. Although she'd left in the early morning hours shrouded by darkness, the sights the crew had seen on the 8th had left a deep impression. The fighter pilots landed back on board with still further horror stories. They'd been temporarily decanted to Wheeler Field, which was still in part a smoking ruin, and they'd watched the clear-up. Enterprise also had aboard a number of gunners who'd actually been training ashore during the attack and thus had taken part in the defence of the fleet. Air Group 6, with 18 aircraft per squadron, a mixture of F-4Fs, TBD Devastators and SBD-2 Dauntlesses, the latter making up both the bombing and scout squadrons, were her offensive arm. But, after the brief but abortive attempts to find the Kilo Battalion on the 7th, her subsequent targets would be rather different. The Imperial Japanese Navy had placed a submarine cordon around Hawaii to try and catch any US ships escaping the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, but had almost immediately disrupted this by ordering some of the subs on various other missions at the very last minute. However, one of the big Japanese submarines, the I-6, spotted and reported Enterprise after she'd been at sea for barely over 24 hours. Other submarines were duly ordered to close in, chase and sink the carrier, although it should be noted that I-6 had misidentified the Enterprise as a Lexington-class vessel. With the aircraft of VS-6 out on patrol duty, they quickly began to report submarines closing in at almost all angles, and some of those reports were actually genuine. But since the aircraft came armed with bombs, they decided they were also going to go on the offensive, and at 0600 in the morning, Ensign Perry Leaf sent his VS-6 Dauntless into a dive after a large submarine he spotted. His bombs fell slightly off target, but unknown to him, it damaged the submarine. This was the I-70, and she was damaged enough that she could no longer submerge. Later on in the afternoon, another VS-6 pilot was scouting roughly the same area. This was Lieutenant Junior Grade Clarence Dickinson, Jr. 3 days earlier, he'd been one of the Dauntlesses shot down by Japanese Zeros over Pearl Harbor. His gunner, Bill Miller, had not survived the encounter, but Dickinson had managed to float down on his parachute, made himself known to the nearby locals, and managed to rejoin his ship the next day. With a new gunner, Thomas Merritt, aboard, he began a climb to the optimal dive altitude. Merritt, conscious of his brand new job, kept asking if the bomb they were carrying was armed, as it would do no good to drop a dud. Eventually, this line of questioning grew so annoying for Dickinson, he snapped back that yes, in fact, he had armed the bomb, and would his gunner please just relax. Oddly enough, to both their perceptions, in the 10 minutes or so it had taken between the submarine spotting them and opening fire with its deck gun, and the aircraft arriving at the dive position, the sub had made no move to submerge. Of course, thanks to its previous damage, it couldn't actually do that, but there was no way for the American aircrew to actually know that. But, not looking a gift horse in the mouth, the Dauntless duly tipped over and screamed down, with the sub's machine guns now adding to the deck gun's fire as the range closed. But the anti-aircraft fire did little good. The bomb dropped and landed smartly next to the submarine amidships. By the time Dickinson pulled out of the dive and circled back, the submarine was already visibly lower in the water, and in less than 40 seconds it was gone entirely. Enterprise had opened her score sheet. The rest of her escort group were jumpy with the prospect of so many submarines in the area, and a large number of attacks on submerged contacts were reported over the next few days by the escorting vessels. Mostly these turned out to be unfortunate whales and orcas. Eventually, Admiral Halsey, now in command of the task force with Enterprise at its centre, remonstrated with his forces that if even half the reported torpedo tracks had been real, then pretty much every submarine in the Japanese fleet was now surely out of torpedoes and should be heading home to reload, and therefore wasting depth charges on the local fish population, which was of course neutral in the matters of human warfare, was something of a waste. Still, the news from outside the ship was not that encouraging. The Philippines had been hit shortly after Pearl Harbor, and the defence wasn't going well. The Asiatic squadron had taken a pasting. The Allied Prince of Wales and Repulse had also been sunk by air attack, and everywhere else the Japanese seemed to be on the offensive, while the Enterprise was patrolling northwest of her home base. There was a bright spot in the form of the heavy losses inflicted on the Japanese by the defenders of Wake Island, but then that place too also fell. On the 20th, the dive bombers went after yet another submarine. This time, not only was the submarine real, but they missed. Luckily, however, it turned out this was a good thing, as the errant vessel was in fact the USS Pompano, which would go on with its own rather notable service career. The year ended with the ship back in harbour, restocking once again, before heading out on another patrol. But this patrol was cut short after a little over a week, as it had been decided to send the ship out on the offensive at last, and so on the 10th of January 1942, everyone was occupied cramming in stores to every available space. Although the Yorktown was on its way to the Pacific at that stage, the fleet only had 3 operational carriers in theatre: the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, and the next day it wasn't even that, as Saratoga was torpedoed by a submarine in the same area that Enterprise had just been patrolling, sending the older carrier back into dry dock for the rest of the first half of 1942. But Enterprise was heading west along with 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a tanker. It had been assumed that the Japanese would move to take Samoa, and so Yorktown was outbound from San Diego with reinforcements loaded in transports, primarily US Marines. Enterprise's group was to rendezvous with them, cover the reinforcements' landing, at least assuming the Japanese hadn't got there first, and then they were to head off for further action. Although there had been no enemy contact since the early days of the war and the submarine hunt, the war was still taking its toll. On the 14th, a man was washed overboard and lost from the escorting destroyer USS Blue, and then on the 16th a series of tragic events struck. The cruiser Salt Lake City lost a man to an accident in one of her 8-inch turrets. Then a Dauntless crash-landed, tore an arrestor cable from its mount and fell over the side. As it went, the cable sheared off one of the landing gear wheels, which careened across the deck and fatally injured a chief petty officer who'd been with the ship since commissioning. And, to top it all off, one of the Devastators radioed in to report that it was lost and low on fuel. Shortly thereafter, it signalled that it was ditching. But the fleet could not afford to break off course to search for the aircraft, and the 3 men, who survived a textbook water landing, would end up spending a harrowing 34 days adrift in their small yellow raft, eventually washing up 750 miles away on a small island less than 24 hours before a typhoon swept in that would surely have drowned them if they'd still been at sea. By the 18th, Enterprise had met up with her sister ship, and for the next week she patrolled around Samoa as the reinforcements were unloaded. Then Halsey announced the 2 carriers' next plan of action. The concern was that the Japanese would use their bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands as staging points for their push south, so the US Navy would now attempt to damage or destroy those bases to hinder such efforts. Yorktown was given a more southerly list of targets, while Enterprise hit the more northern ones. It would take the better part of another week to get there, and the trip was somewhat enlivened when a scouting Dauntless almost shot down a friendly flying boat, which had a Royal New Zealand Air Force crew, when they encountered each other, since neither party expected the other to be there. On the 28th, Enterprise celebrated a first for a US Navy large warship when she refueled at sea at night, a circumstance that was forced upon her by most of the daylight hours having been spent refueling all the escorts. As they closed on their targets, Halsey ordered every ship to break out ropes and lines to rig themselves for towing operations, both as the towee and the tower, so that they would be immediately ready should the fleet be hit by a Japanese attack or counterattack, as otherwise rigging a ship for tow could take some time. Luck was with the ship, though, as a Japanese scouting aircraft was spotted on radar, but it turned out that the formation had already managed to close the distance such that the scout, which had headed straight out from its base to a predetermined distance before turning 90 degrees, was now diligently describing an arc of search that was several dozen miles behind them. Some amusement was then had when an officer reported sand blowing in his face. Initially, this could be very bad, as it would mean that they were far too close to land, since the wind would have picked up sand and blown it towards them. Halsey immediately ordered the navigator to confirm the ship's position, only for it to almost simultaneously be pointed out by someone with sharper eyes that the sand was actually coming from a lookout position above them, as a sailor was trying, somewhat inexpertly, to pour sugar into his coffee as his position swayed back and forth, and was instead liberally anointing all the men below. As dawn approached on February the 1st, the ship's executive officer composed a short poem which he included in the briefing as the pilots prepared to launch. The poem read thus: "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This Sunday it's our turn to shoot. Remember Pearl Harbor." Fortunately for all concerned, the flying capabilities of the ship's air group were considerably in excess of the collective onboard poetry skills. With light still being provided by the full moon, the entire complement of 36 Dauntlesses rumbled into the sky, followed by half the Devastators, all loaded with bombs, and heading for Kwajalein. The other half of VT-6 was loaded up with torpedoes and on hot standby just in case enemy ships were detected. A 37th Dauntless followed, carrying the carrier air group commander, Commander Howard Young, who would oversee the attacks. Each Dauntless carried a 500-pound bomb and a pair of 100-pounders, while the Devastators were loaded down with a trio of 500-pounders. Once they were off, it was the fighters' turn, with half a dozen Wildcats placed on combat air patrol, then 2 formations of half a dozen each loaded with light bombs for secondary strike targets. And just like that, apart from the 9 Devastators on hot standby, Enterprise's hangar and flight decks were completely clear. The Japanese defenders, though, were on alert, and as the attacks commenced, so did opposition fire. VS-6's commander, Hal Hopping, led the first half-dozen Dauntlesses in the main attack, but was almost immediately jumped by a freshly launched Japanese fighter just as he released his bombs. The Dauntless levelled out after release, but would never climb again, instead gently coasting into the Pacific waters as tracer fire from both the fighter and anti-aircraft guns on the ground intersected with Hopping's aircraft. His was the first of 4 Dauntlesses shot down over the primary target. 2 others would fall in this Spain assault, and a 4th, which had experienced engine trouble and tagged along with the slower Devastators, would be lost slightly later. The fighter attacks went after Milualap and Warship. At the latter, they spotted ships at anchor as well as extensive shore facilities, and so the call went out for shore bombardment, to which the cruisers Northampton and Salt Lake City as well as the destroyer Dunlap responded, while the Chester and more destroyers headed to Milualap. At Milualap, the Wildcats encountered A-5M Claude fighters already airborne. This encounter went well for the US formation, managing to shoot down at least one of them, although a head-to-head pass between an F-4F and an A-5M left both pilots rather sheepishly heading for their respective homes, after they failed to hit each other with bullets, but contrived to partially ram each other with their aircraft instead, the Japanese pilot's wingtips slicing off the Americans' radio antenna and leaving liberal amounts of paint along the upper fuselage. The main strike group also spotted ships in their harbour, one of the Dauntlesses saving its 500-pounder from being dropped on a land target to instead land a hit on the stern of the light cruiser Katori. But they also misidentified a transport and a pair of oilers as a pair of carriers, and as a result the 9 torpedo-armed Devastators were quickly launched. These pressed their attack and sank the transport, the Bordeaux Maru, despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. A submarine and 7 other ships of varying sizes were also damaged by various American attacks, although it initially seemed like they'd lost 3 of the Devastators in exchange, only for the half-dozen apparent survivors to then be cheered by a radio call from the missing 3. In an effort to throw off the anti-aircraft gunners, they'd kept low, almost at wave-top height after dropping their torpedoes, instead of pulling up after release, and so they'd eventually popped up to altitude and then headed home, out of sight of their comrades. The extensive nature of the Japanese facilities they discovered meant that aircraft were soon being dispatched for follow-up attacks pretty much as soon as they'd landed. 2 groups of 9 Dauntlesses and 1 group of 8, along with the first 9 Devastators, would be sent back out. The first 2 groups headed to Malualap, and the last combined group aimed at Vortice. But the extensive nature of the Japanese installations, combined with stiffening resistance, which cost the air group another Dauntless that was mobbed by at least 3 enemy fighters, plus damage to the Chester, which was bombed by a group of twin-engine bombers that had managed to get airborne from somewhere else, persuaded Halsey that it was time to make tracks for home just before 1:30 in the afternoon. It wasn't a moment too soon either. The bombers which had attacked Chester had spent the middle part of the day refueling and rearming, and they soon appeared in pursuit, weaving through clouds to evade most of the combat air patrol. 5 bombers emerged from their latest cover in a shallow dive headed for the Enterprise. The anti-aircraft guns of the fleet opened up, but the nerves of their first proper wartime engagement told. The rate of fire was excellent, but to a man they all seemed to be aiming directly at their attackers instead of leading them, and so the bomber's attack was trailed by a series of smoke puffs as 5-inch shells missed behind them. There was precious little that many on deck could do, apart from watch the bomb bay doors open and the rapidly growing specks of various bombs begin to fall. Luckily, the bombs all missed, but a few landed close enough to send splinters and spray into the ship's port side. One landed only about 50 feet away. This sent splinters aboard which severed an aviation gasoline line, which then sprayed fuel over the port side aft anti-aircraft gallery. Moments later, either the hot fragments or possibly some severed electrical cables made the fuel catch fire, and soon that whole section of the ship was ablaze. As the damage control crews worked to contain the fires, one of the bombers, which had one engine smoking, was seen to turn back. This was the squadron leader, Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai. His aircraft had been hit by a few bursts from the combat air patrol at the last moment before he entered his attack run, and as the bomber passed close to the Enterprise, some of the shorter-range anti-aircraft fire had also taken its toll. Concluding that he wasn't going to make it back to base, Nakai was directing his aircraft right at the crowded flight deck at full throttle. Every available anti-aircraft gun opened up, and soon both the bomber's engines were on fire. But it didn't matter. It still came on. Machinist mate Bruno Guido found himself watching the approach from near a Dauntless. He decided, well, he wasn't going to die quietly, so he rushed into the gunner's seat, unlocked the bomber's rear-firing machine gun, and opened up as well. At the last moment, Captain Murray on the bridge grabbed the ship's wheel and sent the carrier heeling into a sharp starboard turn. It turned out to be just enough. Although the bomber made a last-minute lurch to follow, whether from control failure or a last-minute course correction, it skimmed the deck and fell into the sea instead of impacting fully, the only signs left of its passing being a severed wing which was lodged in the catwalk, a pool of aviation gas splashed over the deck, and the severed halves of Dauntless S5, with a somewhat stunned Guido staring at the point 10 feet away, where the bomber's wing had cut past him and through the aircraft he was in. 2 hours later, 2 more bombers attempted an assault, but evasive action saw them miss as well, and the Combat Air Patrol claimed one of them as it withdrew. They also managed to shoot down a scouting seaplane just before sunset. And then it was all over. The Enterprise had extracted a price from the Japanese, but it had also come at a cost. A total of 7 Dauntlesses had been lost, most of them shot down, but also including the one that Nakai had taken out at the last moment. 1 Wildcat had also crashed on takeoff and the pilot had been killed, and 1 Devastator had made a water landing, although the crew in that case had been picked up. 4 days later, Enterprise was back in Pearl Harbor to a riotous reception. Although, in the abstract, the raid had been a little bit of a pebble thrown into the face of a tidal wave that was the Japanese advance, it was nonetheless the first engagement that could properly be called a victory in a time when almost all the other news coming out of the Pacific was bad. But despite the need for new aircraft, new pilots, resupply, refueling, and a little bit of repairs, Enterprise was only allocated a little over a week in port. The pilots of Air Group 6 quickly became notorious. They'd immediately chafed at the news that whiskey in Hawaii was being rationed at 1 bottle per week per person, and so they contrived to present a united front in asserting that, since they were now clearly in the business of attacking islands, they all needed extensive training in cross-country flying and approaches to many different airfields. And so soon the skies over Hawaii were being crisscrossed by Wildcats, Devastators, and Dauntlesses shuttling to every known military airstrip that you could possibly find, with some seeming to be under slightly less control than others, as the pilots were naturally drawing their weekly whiskey ration from each and every base, since in the days before the internet, updating stock levels and who exactly had been issued with what took some time to correlate between different air bases. And before anyone asks, yes, the US Navy was dry aboard ship. Hawaii, however, was an island. When they weren't in the process of drinking the island dry, the pilots were also overseeing the installation of additional armor plate into their aircraft. One pilot had gotten back from their previous operation with no less than 14 dents in a homemade slab of metal that he'd slipped behind his pilot's seat, and this had sparked a rather understandable interest in similar measures among many other pilots. 5 days after arriving in port, Halsey received orders for the ship's next operation. Although he was fine with getting back in action quickly, the orders designating his ships as Task Force 13, along with other orders to sail on Friday the 13th, were less than well received. After some quick back and forth, the task force was instead redesignated Task Force 16, and the date of their sailing was changed to Saturday the 14th of February 1942. Task Force 16 thus sailed with an escort of 2 cruisers, as Chester was still being repaired, and 6 destroyers. 5 were familiar faces from their previous mission, and the USS Craven was new. The tanker Sabine rounded out the force, as the Platte, which had been with them before, had been assigned to support the Lexington. The formation then headed northwest, and while listening to the radio, they continued to receive bad news. The Channel Dash had just taken place in Europe, and in their own theatre, Singapore had just fallen. But proving that a good sailor can find amusement in almost any situation, on the 18th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eversole was blown off course in his Devastator while on reconnaissance duty and forced to ditch about 60 miles from the Enterprise. The following morning, when the weather cleared, a search was launched, and soon the bright yellow life raft was spotted, with Eversole seen sitting proudly upright at the stern of the little craft, beating time for his 2 crew as if they were in a medieval galley. The other crew had obviously also survived, and they were making a determined effort to row to Midway, some 250 miles to the east. Once he was recovered and back aboard, his squadron mates relentlessly teased him about whether or not he'd rather transfer to the surface element of the Navy, as he was clearly cut out for ship command. But Enterprise was also in the middle of preparations for its next attack. Less than 3 months earlier, they'd seen Marine aviators off their flight decks in F-4Fs bound to reinforce Wake Island. In the interim, of course, Wake Island had fallen after determined resistance, but now it was time to hit the island's new occupiers. Admiral Spruance would take the 2 cruisers and 2 of the destroyers and attack from the west, while the rest of the group would gather 100 miles north of Wake and launch the airstrikes. The plan was for the cruisers to open fire as the first bombs fell, in order to confuse the Japanese defenders and split their fire. The weather in the darkness before the dawn of the 24th of February was absolutely appalling. A misty, drizzling rain suffused everything and seemed to come from every direction at once. The whirling propellers caught it and created vortexes of condensation which enveloped the aircraft while also reflecting the flames from their exhausts, leaving the pilots essentially blind in a suffused corona of flickering orange light. But with the cruisers approaching their targets and the priority being to launch the strike, Earl Gallagher of VS-6 made an instrument-only takeoff and struggled into the sky, where at least moving at speed cleared the screen somewhat. Perry Teef, following, wasn't so lucky. Disoriented by the lack of vision and the pitching of the ship, his aircraft went off course. The wing clipped one of the 5-inch guns, and the aircraft cartwheeled into the sea. Flight operations were suspended to prevent further loss, while the destroyer Blue raced in to look for survivors, asking for permission to use her searchlight, which was granted. Teef was found missing an eye from being slammed into the gun sight and was recovered from the water. The gunner, Edgar Jinks, also managed to get out of the aircraft, but in the darkness he could be heard but not seen, despite the searchlight crew's best efforts, and he was lost. Flight operations resumed as dawn's first light made it possible to at least vaguely see what was going on, and the somewhat delayed strike package was dispatched, similar to before. Every Dauntless possible, plus 9 Devastators armed with bombs, and the other 9 held back armed with torpedoes. The only significant difference was this time Wade McCluskey was flying top cover with 6 Wildcats accompanying the bombers, while the Standard Combat Air Patrol flew above the carriers. The slightly delayed strike arrived and began to attack in groups of 6, once again loaded with a 500-pound bomb and a pair of 100-pounders on the dive bombers. One of the Dauntless pilots, Ensign Delbert W. Halsey, no relation to the Admiral, spotted an H-6K flying boat, who rather easily outpaced his aircraft when it opened its throttles. He called in the sighting, and McCluskey and his wingman chased after it. 3 Wildcats took their turn at attacking it until the big flying boat suddenly exploded in the face of the 3rd aircraft, leaving a bit of itself embedded in the Wildcat's right wing. Below them, the fuel tanks and other bits of the base were exploding merrily, along with bursts of shells from Spruance's bombardment, and then it was time to head back. Just the one strike this time, with one of the VS-6 Dauntlesses having been shot down over the target. Ensign Foreman and his gunner, Winchester, survived and parachuted out, but were of course captured. As the carrier and its escorts headed to meet up with the cruisers, Halsey received a communique asking him to also hit Marcus Island if he thought the strike was feasible. The island lay about halfway between Wake and some major Japanese bases in the Marianas, about 650 miles from each location, with Japan another 350 miles further west from the Marianas. This was quite deep into enemy-held territory for early 1942, and speed was held to be of the essence. Judging that between the need for a prolonged high-speed run, as well as forecast rough weather, and thus judging that the destroyers probably couldn't keep up, Halsey detailed them to escort the tanker and just set out with Spruance's 2 cruisers in company. They headed west even as news of the loss of the Houston and Langley came in, part of the collapse of ABDA Command, but by the 4th of March, the pre-dawn darkness was once again filled with the sounds of Enterprise's flight group warming up. This would also be a one-and-done deal. This time 17 Dauntlesses from VB6, 14 from VS6, and 6 Wildcats from VF6 all took to the skies, plus the coordinating SBD. The formation had to climb through a thick cloud base and became somewhat separated in doing so. But when they reached the top of it, they realized just how extensive the cloud cover was. All they could see, horizon to horizon, were clouds. Normally, at this point, they'd have to rely on dead reckoning to reach their target, which might as well be guesswork given the complete absence of any identifiable point to reference from. But luckily for them, Lieutenant Baumeister, the Enterprise's radar officer, had come up with a cunning plan. On his scope, he'd used a grease pencil to draw a line that marked the bearing toward Marcus Island, and as the radar swept around, he noted the relative position and movement of the dots representing the ship's flight group, and then had a series of encoded instructions sent out, telling Carrier Air Group Commander Young which course correction he needed to make, as well as how far he'd gone. With the rest of the formation theoretically supposed to follow Young, it kept the attack group roughly on course, such that by 0630 a break in the clouds revealed their target lying dead ahead of them. Once more, poor old VS6 was the one that took casualties, as Dale Hilton and Jack Leeming went down with their aircraft when it was hit by strong defensive fire. They survived, but they fell into the questionable hospitality of the Japanese. With the strike thus completed, the aircraft headed home, all landing before 0845, except for one Wildcat, that of Lieutenant Junior Grade Gray, who also wasn't responding to radio calls. Radar saw a single contact, but, thinking it might be an enemy scout, Enterprise hid in a squall, and thus the contact flew past them. Luckily, though, the radar operator, Baumeister, guessed that that might be Gray, as he remembered the fighter pilot had mentioned previously how his radio had kept detuning itself onto a different frequency. Vaguely scrambling through his memories to recall what frequency Gray had mentioned it constantly dropping to, he ordered the homing beacon switched to cover that set of frequencies, and moments later he was rewarded as the radar blip changed course, with Wildcat arriving with less than 6% of its fuel remaining. By the 10th of March, the carrier was back in Hawaii and everyone took a chance to rest. But there were going to be some major changes afoot. The XO of VT-6 was moving to the Saratoga. The Carrier Air Group Commander, Commander Howard Young, was moved to head up the Advanced Carrier Training Group, with Wade McCluskey moved up to replace him from being the commander of VF-6. The fighter squadron's aircraft were also being replaced. The F4F3s were replaced with F4F4s, which came with a number of improvements. Self-sealing fuel tanks and cockpit armour were now fitted as standard, and instead of 4 50-caliber machine guns that had a tendency to jam, they now had 6, with most of the jamming issues resolved. The single biggest change, though, was that the F4F4 had folding wings, which allowed 27 aircraft to be stored in the same space, as previously there had just been 18. The one point of contention was that all these changes made the 4 a heavier version of the F4F than the 3, despite the power plant being the same, and this would cut into the aircraft's range somewhat. Since VS-6 had taken almost all the air group's casualties thus far, they were landed ashore for some R&R, while VB-3, Saratoga's bombing squadron, was moved aboard to temporarily take their place until VS-6 could be reconstituted. Enterprise herself also looked subtly different. The 50-caliber anti-aircraft machine guns were mostly gone, and in their place were a bunch of the brand new 20mm Oerlikons. She sailed along with the Salt Lake City and the Northampton, plus 4 destroyers and an oiler on the 8th of April, heading northwest. Bad news once again accompanied their deployment, this time the fall of Bataan signalling the last stand of Allied troops on the Philippines themselves. And to cap it all off, nobody knew what their mission was, except for the Admiral, of course. Then, on the 12th, an almost mirror-match formation appeared out of the mist. The carrier Hornet, along with an escort group that matched that of the Enterprise in the form of 2 cruisers, a bunch of destroyers, and an oiler. But instead of US Navy aircraft on deck, there were over a dozen olive-coloured B-25 bombers from the US Army Air Force. Rumours abounded. Was this some kind of weird delivery mission? Only later in the day would Halsey announce their destination, Tokyo. This news was met with great approval. Since Hornet's flight deck was out of action with the bombers taking up the space, it fell to Enterprise's air group to perform scouting duty as the combined formation headed west. When they reached about 1,000 miles from Tokyo, they left the tankers and the destroyers behind, similar to the Marcus Island raid, and pressed on at speed with just the 4 cruisers and 2 carriers. Heavy seas plagued the approach. The idea was to launch the bombers 500 miles from their target, which would allow them another 1,500 miles to get to friendly territory further west, with 100 miles left in the tank as a reserve. However, in the early hours of the 18th, radar began to pick up contacts ahead, possibly Japanese patrol vessels. They skirted the first contacts, but at 07:15, a Dauntless reported yet another patrol vessel 50 miles ahead, and he thought he'd been seen. Halsey pressed on, though. Every 3 minutes that he kept going represented roughly another mile that the bombers didn't have to fly, and they were still well beyond the ideal 500-mile launch point. But then, after half an hour, a patrol ship was physically seen on the horizon, along with a stream of Japanese-language radio chatter being picked up. Although the light cruiser Nashville was dispatched to deal with the vessel, Halsey determined that at this point the risk-reward balance had been reached and ordered the carriers into the wind to launch. They were still 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, but there was little else that they could do. The bombers began launching even as the Nashville and the 8-strong Combat Air Patrol did their very best to put down the 2 patrol craft which the fleet had stumbled across. Hornet's own air group, now free from their confines, joined Enterprise's own aircraft in scouring the seas for further patrol craft as the 2 carriers and their escorts sped towards home, which was just as well as every single bomber, submarine, and other available craft under Imperial Japanese Navy command in the area had been ordered to find and sink them. Even 3 of the Japanese Navy's carriers, on their way back from the Indian Ocean raid, were also ordered to try and find the intruders. But none of these would have any success. After a rapid resupply, the Enterprise left Pearl Harbor again on the 30th of April, along with Hornet. They were now to strike targets in the Southwest Pacific, while Lexington and Yorktown, already in the area, were going to hit others. At least, that was what the official story was. In reality, Nimitz was perfectly aware of a strong Japanese force that was likely to make a go at Port Moresby, and he was trying to get Task Force 16 into the area fast enough to support Task Force 14, the aforementioned Lexington and Yorktown. Although Enterprise had also had a Marine F4F squadron placed aboard that they were supposed to deliver to Efate. During their brief stop at Pearl Harbor, VB-3 had also gone ashore and good old VS-6 had come back aboard. But Enterprise was still 2 days sailing out when the Battle of Coral Sea began, and they were barely 24 hours away when it ended, with the loss of the Lexington and damage to the Yorktown in exchange for sinking the small carrier Shoho and damage to the larger Shikaku. However, the fact that the main battle was over didn't mean that this voyage would be without cost to the Enterprise. Extensive search efforts were made in case the Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers were in fact trying to circle around to find and catch and hit Yorktown, but this effort cost them 2 Dauntless, which were forced to ditch. One crew managed to make it to safety, but the other vanished into the sea, never to be seen again. Lieutenant Junior Grade Herman was also lost when his Wildcat stalled out on takeoff and span into the ocean. Another 7 aircraft were written off to varying degrees in hard landings and the like. But soon another order came over the radio from Nimitz: expedite return, which was naval slang for get back here and get back here yesterday. The carriers did an about-face and raced towards Pearl Harbor, arriving on the 26th of May to find provisions already stacked up along their mooring points waiting for them. Fresh aircraft were brought aboard to replace those that had been lost, and the crew were told that they would only have 1 or 2 days in port. They'd be sailing out again as soon as the ship was ready. Nearby Hornet was getting the same treatment, as they watched Yorktown in dry dock taking on the appearance of some massive food item being swarmed by a particularly industrious set of ants, as anyone who wasn't storing her sister ships was ordered to try and patch her up. Clearly, something big was coming. But whatever it was, Admiral Halsey wouldn't be there for it. Although many aboard thought that the only way that Halsey was ever going to leave the Enterprise was if he was blown off of it by a bomb hit or if the ship sank under him, the simple fact was that the stress of the last few months had compounded existing health conditions, and the poor man was desperately ill and underweight. He left the ship to recuperate and recommended Admiral Spruance take his place. And so, on the 28th of May 1942, under Admiral Spruance's command, Enterprise stood out to sea again. Between her and Hornet were 6 cruisers and 9 destroyers, while the air groups streamed back in. The first landing wasn't a particularly brilliant omen. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay, in charge of VT-6, saw his Devastator suddenly lose speed on final approach, stall, hit the deck, and then spin off to the side. Luckily, the destroyer Monaghan was standing by, just in case something like this happened, and pulled the 3 slightly dazed crew out of the water. They'd be back aboard the Enterprise the next day. Fortunately for all concerned, the rest of the landings went much better, and soon enough the fleet was heading for a date with history. Their destination? Midway.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.